How good can tight end Cade Otton be in year number 2? I'm going to tell you that and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into this Monday episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, for making Locked On Bucs your first listen or view of the day every day. Don't forget, you can subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor, hit the like button. It'll help other Buccaneers fans find us just like you did. And of course, you can follow me. I am your host on this episode, David Harrison, on Twitter at dharrison82. Credential member of the media, staff writer for BucsGameDay.com, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site, covering the Buccaneers. Here with you Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for now. We will return 5 days per week in mid-July. But as always, I want to give a special shout out to the everydayers and thank you for your continued support of the show. On today's episode of Locked On Bucs, we're going to discuss the wide receiver and tight end groups as part of our training camp preview series. But before we get there, I have to tell you that this episode is sponsored by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Hitting the receiver and tight end position groups on today's training camp preview episode, and we'll try to answer the question, how good can Cade Otton be in 2023, using some empirical data of year 2 tight ends to give us some baseline numbers that we can play with. That's coming up. But first, we got to talk about the training camp depth chart projections. There is no official depth chart in the NFL right now at this time of year. But from looking at the rosters, looking at the notes from Logan Robinson, BucsGameDay.com guys who've been on ground, here is how I see the wide receiver depth chart shaking out as we stand today, give or take a player or two. Right now, Mike Evans, of course, your wide receiver number 1. Chris Godwin is 2. Russell Gage, when he's healthy, 3. Now I've got Devin Tompkins, Kalen Geiger, Trey Palmer, all kind of right there together as co-wide receiver 4s, kind of depending on the situation. I think Trey Palmer has done a lot for himself to kind of move up that list potentially. I will have a depth chart projection following training camp that I will lay on you at the end of segment 2 here. David Moore, the veteran, coming in. I think he's got to be part of that conversation. Raheem Jarrett certainly has done a lot of good for himself, but Cade Warner, Ryan Miller, Tay Barber also competing for roster spots and practice squad spots here with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this year. Looking at the tight end position, I've got Cade Otton, number 1, Keefe, number 2, Peyton Durham, number 3. But that could be an interesting topic to discuss as well. David Wells, Tanner Taola, and Dominique Darnley filling out the rest of the tight end group. Now, position group battles and storylines. Wide receiver 3, I think, is a position group battle that we've got to watch. And it's not so much because I think Trey Palmer could really be better per se than Russell Gage is. You know, Trey's first year in the NFL and all that stuff. But Russell Gage is just, he's been injured a lot, right? And unfortunately, he continues to get injured. That's going to be part of our conversation here and moving up in just a little bit in some storylines. But I think that could become a battle if Russell Gage can't stay healthy in training camp. Wide receiver 5. So if Russell Gage, Trey Palmer are 3 and 4, wide receiver 5, Devin Tompkins, Kalen Geiger, and I'm going to add David Moore in there, the veteran, knows the Seahawks system, knows Dave Canales, was brought here for that reason. So I think that he certainly could be a threat for that wide receiver 5 position, and that could leave 2 guys fighting out for that 6th position if they do keep 6. Don't expect the team to necessarily keep 7, but, you know, stranger things have happened. And then the tight end side of things, I think tight end 2 is a storyline that we're going to keep an eye on. Keefe definitely did better as a receiver last year than I think a lot of people expected him to, but Payne Durham is kind of that guy with that major receiving upside. So depending on how training camp and the preseason goes, wouldn't necessarily be surprised to see Payne Durham close that gap a little bit very quickly on Keefe for tight end 2. And of course, tight end 2 could kind of come down to packages and situations anyway, and it could just be a name on a paper versus an actual usage thing. So, you know, how much of that is semantics and how much of that is real is something that we'll discuss as well throughout training camp and the preseason. But moving on to some storylines, obviously, Mike Evans can't do anything about his 1,000-yard record in the preseason in training camp, but it's something we're going to talk about, something he's going to be asked about. Year 10 this season for Mike Evans. Getting another 1,000 yards would bring him 1 year from Jerry Rice's record of 11 straight and 4 from Jerry Rice's record of 14 total. So, of course, we all want to see Mike Evans get a little bit closer to number 80, Jerry Rice there. Of course, Chris Godwin, another receiver to watch. This is his second year. This actually will be a training camp preseason storyline. Second year coming back from that injured ACL that the New Orleans Saints dirtily gave to him a couple years ago. So usually people who suffered those ACLs, they say year 2 is the real year you start to kind of feel like yourself again. So we'll see what that looks like. And then again, Russell Gage's health is going to be a storyline that we're going to talk about a lot, and we're going to talk about often. We already kind of have, but we're going to continue to discuss it. Year 1 with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he missed 4 games altogether, only started 4 games the entire season, the fewest games he's played in his career so far, the fewest games started since 2019. And of course, he was brought over from the Atlanta Falcons because of the damage that we had seen Russell Gage do to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in years past. So that was something that they were wanting to bring in to Tampa. And look, when he was on the field, not bad. You know what I mean? The stats projected out to 17 games, 66 catches would have been the second most in his career. 557 yards would have been the third most in his career, and 6 touchdowns would have been the most in his career. So when Russell Gage was on the field, certainly looked like a quality player, certainly looked like someone that the Buccaneers could build around and build on, and certainly a player that you think Tom Brady could have taken advantage of, again, if he was on the field more. And even some of the games that he did play were games that he got injured in or was not able to play in a lot just because of the injuries that were starting to stack up. So hopefully we get to see more. Hopefully we get to see Mike Evans gearing up for that 1,000-yard run. We're going to talk more about that here in the next segment. Hopefully we get to see Chris Godwin looking, feeling, playing faster, healthier, and more confident in year 2 coming back from the ACL. And hopefully we get to see Russell Gage stay healthy as well and be able to contribute to what the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are trying to do in 2023. Another player, however, who's going to be a big part, I think, of what the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are going to or not going to do if they don't get him involved enough is Cade Otton, tight end number 1 this year with the departure of Cam Brate. How much of a step can Cade Otton take in year 2? That's something that I'm going to evaluate coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Bucs is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you can have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you need to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. And it's so easy to post a job. Even a podcast host like myself can do it. I don't really hire anybody, but I've been through the process. I've just seen the steps. It's super easy to do. And once you get your job down, you can throw the purple hashtag frame, hiring frame around your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you are hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs number 1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Continuing today's conversation, wide receiver, tight end group, training camp preview with our burning training camp questions. And I'm going to start off with a burning training camp question about Mike Evans's 1,000-yard record that he is looking to extend this NFL season. Of course, again, like I mentioned already, can't do anything about extending it in the preseason statistically, but he could do something about extending it by getting on the same page and getting comfortable with quarterback Baker Mayfield. But the question I think we need to answer or talk about is, how important is it really for Mike Evans and Baker Mayfield to get into a rhythm early on in training camp and preseason before the regular season? Well, to answer that question, everydayers and those of you who have been here for a while know that I like to talk about numbers. So I went through and I looked at the last 3 first years with a new starting quarterback, right? So we're talking 2020 with Tom Brady, we're talking 2015 with Jameis Winston, and we're talking 2014 with Josh McCown. Now, 2014 was also Mike Evans' rookie season, but again, his first year with a starting quarterback. 2015, Jameis Winston's first year with the starting quarterback there for Mike Evans. And then 2020, when Tom Brady came in to replace Jameis Winston, first year with a new starting quarterback. Yes, I know Ryan Fitzpatrick started, I think 2017, right? Those games while Jameis was suspended, but he wasn't the QB1, you know what I mean? So I didn't take that into account. I went with Tom, Jameis, and Josh instead. So maybe you would have gone a different direction. That's the direction that I decided to go. Starting off with the last one, first year with Tom Brady, 2020 preseason, canceled. Didn't even have one. 0 reps, 0 snaps. I mean, we all know there was the high school practices with the helicopters and all the craziness going on, right? But officially, no preseason happened in that first season. In the regular season, Mike Evans, who's, again, played 9 seasons so far, was able to accumulate 109 targets, which was 9th best in his career, so worst. 70 receptions, 7th most in his career, 1,006 yards, 8th most in his career, and 13 touchdowns, 2nd most in his career. So no preseason to work with Tom Brady in game action. And you saw a few lows, right? So 9th place, 7th place, 8th place. TDs was good, but he had that one game where he had like 16 yards and 16 touchdowns, and that contributed to that. So maybe a little bit of effect there, right? Some low numbers career-wise in comparison. His first year with Jameis Winston, 2015, he played. Mike Evans did in 2 games with Jameis, had 5 targets, no catches. Proceeded to have 148 targets, which is to this day 2nd most in his career, 74 catches, which is tied for 4th, 1,206 yards, which is 3rd, and 12 touchdowns, tied for 3rd. So again, 2 games played, only 5 targets, but he got 2 games on the field with his quarterback, and it produced one of the better years in Mike Evans's career as an individual player. Now, his first year with Josh McCown, also his first year in the National Football League. And again, I went with Josh. He was the week 1 starter in 2014, started 11 games, started more than Mike Glennon. So that's why I went with Josh McCown. 2014 preseason, he played 3 games. Mike Evans did, had 7 targets, 5 catches, 96 yards, and a touchdown, and produced 122 targets in the regular season, 6th most in his career, 68 catches, 8th most in his career, 1,051 yards, 6th most in his career, and 5 touchdowns, 8th in his career. So some more mid-level type of numbers here, despite playing more games and actually having more receptions and yards with Josh McCown in that season. Now, of course, McCown started 11 of the games, so 5 games he didn't play with his starting quarterback. So maybe that had something to do with it. But you can kind of see there's not really this direct correlation with more preseason action means better regular season production is kind of the point that we're trying to make here. In fact, the best season, or the best, the lowest, I would say the lowest overall season. I think if you had to peg like worst season for Mike Evans, I mean, when you're getting 1,000 yards every year, no season is really a terrible season, right? But when you have to peg the worst, I think I kind of settled in on 2017. I went with 136 targets, which was 4th in his career, 71 receptions, which is 6th, 1,001 yards. And that's the reason I picked it. It's the most cutting it close. I mean, literally 1 yard. 9th place, obviously, in his career, and 5 TDs, 8th in his career. In that season, he played 2 preseason games, had 13 targets, 9 catches, 115 yards, which statistically is his best preseason of his career. Obviously, that was with Jameis. Well, that was the 2017 season, so I was with Jameis and Ryan. But the best preseason he had resulted in the closest cut he had to making the 1,000 yards. So again, so I don't know. So, just the reason I bring this up, because certainly, we want to hear about chemistry getting built in training camp. But I would just say, if you watch the preseason games and you don't see Baker and Mike lighting up opponents necessarily, don't hit the panic button too quickly, because that's basically why I brought all this up, to show you that the lack of preseason production doesn't necessarily mean a lack of regular season production, and even good preseason production isn't necessarily going to inspire great regular season production with Mike Evans. But we know that Mike Evans has all the availability or the ability in the world to make it happen with lesser quarterbacks. So Baker Mayfield should, and again, assuming Baker Mayfield wins the competition, maybe Kyle Trask will, should be able to make it happen, right? So certainly want to hear about the chemistry, but again, if you're worried about the benchmarks, you don't need it necessarily in the preseason games to ensure that Mike Evans continues his streak. But going from a guy who's in his 10th year in the NFL, talking to a guy who's in his 2nd year in the NFL, and James, I think, is going to like this conversation a little bit. What is Cade Otton's ceiling? Of course, there's really no way for me to look at tape and say, well, if you watch this route, or if you watch that route, or if you watch this pass, if you watch that pass, it's clear to see that Cade Otton could be a 10,000-yard receiver this year, right? But what I did is I went ahead and I just looked at some data, and I said, let's look at some NFL players. Let's look at some NFL players in the last however seasons, and let's kind of look at the natural progression or the average progression for a good, solid receiver, solid tight end that is in the NFL. So what I did is I looked up the top 10 second seasons by a tight end in the Super Bowl era, and I ordered them in order of receiving yards. So again, these players are all in their second year in the NFL in the Super Bowl era, the best seasons by yards of any tight ends. The top season had by a second-year tight end in the Super Bowl era so far is George Kittle, San Francisco 49ers. His second season was 2018, had 136 targets, 88 catches, 1,377 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Now, going through the list of top 10 names, you got Rob Gronkowski in there from 2011, Jimmy Graham from 2011, Jason Witten in 2004 with the Dallas Cowboys, Antonio Gates with the Chargers in 2004, Aaron Hernandez with the New England Patriots in 2011, Kellen Winslow with the Browns in 2006, Travis Kelce with the Chiefs in 2014, Mark Andrews with the Ravens in 2019, and Todd Heap with the Ravens in 2002. So the top 10 second seasons among tight ends since the Super Bowl era have all come in the 2000s and beyond. So certainly showing kind of an illustration of the era of football that we've been living in. Now, the biggest second-year jump for one of these tight ends in the Super Bowl era was 954 yards, and that came from Jimmy Graham, who in his second season with the New Orleans Saints in 2011 had 149 targets, 99 catches, over 1,300 yards and 11 touchdowns. That 1,310 yards was a 954-yard jump from his first year. So these massive jumps are possible. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm just saying it's possible. And I don't think many people saw Jimmy Graham coming from year 1 to year 2, having a nearly 1,000-yard jump in his production. Smallest jump from the top 10 tight ends here was 300 yards. And that was achieved by Mark Andrews, who had 852 yards in his second season, 552 yards in his first. And the average, when you take all 10 of these guys and you average out their jumps, the average is 676. So if we're looking for Cade Otton to become maybe one of the top 10 second-year tight ends since the Super Bowl era began, then the biggest jump he could possibly have would have him netting 1,345 yards. That would make him second all-time for a second-year tight end, right behind George Kittle, and would be a 344% jump in his production from yards. Now, again, that's Jimmy Graham type numbers, right? Nobody expects that to happen. Now, if you have the smallest jump, the 300-yard bump, then Cade Otton would come away this season with 691 yards and would be number 19 overall among second-year tight ends in Super Bowl era with a 177% bump in receiving yards. I think that's more kind of realistic. The average jump, if you added that, then Cade Otton would come down with 1,067 yards, would be number 4 all-time among second-year tight ends in the Super Bowl era with a 273% jump. 2022, Cade Otton had 42 catches, 391 yards, and 2 touchdowns if you look at his 16 games, 11 starts. If you turn those 11 starts into 16, 17 starts, then the projections have him out to 64 catches, 604 yards, 3 touchdowns. So you're already near that number 19 ranking, the smallest jump, right? 691 yards would make him 19th. So you're already at about a 604-yard pace if Cade Otton is a starter with the stats that he got last year. So is it realistic to see him get to that level? Well, sure, it's realistic to see him get to that level because he was already playing at that level without the amount of reps that you would need to get. Now, the Gronk is that you, quote unquote, level, he would have 144 catches, 1,345 yards, and 6 touchdowns. I don't think that's happening, but man, you would love to see it happen for Cade, right? Tight end number 1. I think if you want to come away from this season saying Cade Otton is the Buccaneers tight end number 1, then you want to shoot for 114 catches, 1,067 yards, and 5 touchdowns. And I know with this offense, with these weapons, a tight end getting over 1,000 yards seems very, very much of a long shot right now. On the way to tight end 1, which I think is more realistic. I think most people, if you ask most people what you want to see from Cade Otton exiting 2023, you just want to say you want to look at a guy and say he can be the number 1 tight end in Tampa Bay. I think that stat line needs to look like 74 catches, 691 yards, and 3 touchdowns. So to me, that's much more realistic, much more attainable. But of course, we'll take, especially James, we'll take all of those other stat lines, 1,067, 1,345 yards, bring it every single day. My post-training camp prediction for these depth charts, I've got 6 receivers making the active roster: Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Russell Gage, Trey Palmer, and then I've got Devin Tompkins and David Moore making the active roster with Kalen Geiger, Rakeem Jarrett, and Cade Warner heading to the practice squad. 3 tight ends on my roster: Cade Otton, Keith Payne Durham. I've got David Wells and Tanner Taula heading to the practice squad. Now let's take a look at some national rankings and fantasy projections next up here on Locked On Bucs. Wrapping up our receiver and tight end group position preview ahead of training camp. I think that made sense. We're going to start out with some national rankings here. PFF has Mike Evans as receiver number 11 in their rankings, and they have Chris Godwin as receiver number 21. They don't have any tight ends, Cade Otton or otherwise, ranked from the Buccaneers in their top 15 tight ends. And then Fantasy Pros looking at their fantasy projections for these Buccaneers players in a half PPR league. That is what I play in, so that's what my projections are going to be in. If we're talking about 12-team leagues, which is what I play in as well, then you're going to draft at least 48 wide receivers. If everybody drafts 4, which everybody should be drafting at least 4, if not more. So that's kind of the line we're drawing here. 2 Buccaneers wide receivers make it ahead of wide receiver 48. That is wide receiver 24, Chris Godwin. So Fantasy Pros has Chris Godwin above Mike Evans for fantasy purposes. They've got you drafting Chris Godwin after Drake London, but before Christian Watson. Only because of the split that Chris Godwin is facing with Mike Evans would I maybe say Drake London is okay. But I don't have a lot of faith in that team's passing attack. The Atlanta Falcons, I think a lot of running is coming with Bijan Robinson in that group. So I don't know about Drake London. Personally, I think Drake London is off my draft list this year. Maybe he'll be on there next year, depending on what the Falcons look like. But this year, I think Drake London's on my do not draft list. I do like Chris Godwin before Christian Watson. I don't know if I'm drafting any Packers either until I see enough from Jordan Love. Mike Evans, coming after Chris Godwin, might be a little bit of a surprise to you. Wide receiver 33 on the Fantasy Pros board after Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. No, I'll take Mike Evans first. Thank you. And before Treylon Burks, which if you take any Buccaneers receiver after you take Treylon Burks and Ryan Tannehill, that is a problem. Some other Buccaneers wide receivers that did not make the cut in the top 48. Wide receiver 89 is Russell Gage, coming after Tim Patrick, but before Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. Trey Palmer is wide receiver 143. He's the fourth receiver on fantasy charts, according to the Buccaneers stack, after Cedric Wilson Jr. from the Miami Dolphins, but before De'Ami Brown of the Washington Commanders. Rakeem Jarrett also makes the rankings. So Rakeem Jarrett makes the practice squad rankings for me, but apparently for Fantasy Pros makes the active rankings. 219 after N'Keal Harry, who's a free agent, so take that with a grain of salt, and before Steve Sims Jr. from Houston. In 12-team leagues, you're drafting 24 tight ends or more. Most people are going to draft a starter and a backup. Tight end 33 is Cade Otton. He is the only tight end that fits that mark. No tight ends fit that mark, but he is the highest tight end for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers after Logan Thomas of the Washington Commanders, but before Austin Hooper of the Las Vegas Raiders. Personally, if you think Cade Otton is going to be there that far down the board, I take a starting tight end early, and then I take Cade Otton with my last pick in the draft and hope that gamble pays off, and maybe we get a Gronk is that you style season at a Cade Otton. Tight end 80 is Keith after Bryson Hopkins of the Los Angeles Rams, but before Tegan Quitoriano of the Houston Texans. Payne Durham comes in at tight end 97 after Parker Hess of the Atlanta Falcons, but before Will Mallory of the Indianapolis Colts. I ran a mock draft on Fantasy Pros. Mike Evans was drafted 7-6, so the 6th pick of the 7th round, and that it was a 1 through 12 round and not a 12 through 1 round. Either way, middle of the 7th round. So if you want him and you're not picking, and you're picking after 7-6, you want to take him probably in the 6th round if you're going to go Mike Evans. Chris Godwin, 502, again, a 1 to 12 round. So you're talking early part of the 5th round. So if you want Chris Godwin, you don't have an early 5th round pick, then you're going to want to spend your 4th round pick on Chris Godwin. No other receivers, no tight ends for the Buccaneers drafted on that mock draft. Coming up Wednesday, James will be back, so make sure you come back for that post 4th of July episode of Locked On Bucs. In the meantime, if you've got any questions for us, let's get a mailbag episode going. Drop them in the YouTube comments, email them lockedonbucspodcast@gmail.com, or hit either of us up on Twitter. Thank you so much for making Locked On Bucs first listen of the day every day. Thanks for making us part of your day, part of your football routine. And if you got anything else Buccaneers related you want to talk about or know, hit us up on Twitter. James is at Yarcho_Bucs. I am at DHarrison82, and the show is at Locked On Bucs. So we speak again. Please be safe, be kind, fire the cannons, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.